I am proud to introduce to the podium Dr. Amalia Levy. She is an archivist and a cultural heritage professional and the executive director for programs at HeritEdge. She holds a PhD from the Bonn Center for Slavery and Dependency Studies at the University of Bonn. Her master's degree in library sciences with a concentration in archives and an MA in history with a focus on Jewish studies are both from the University of Maryland. Her MA in museum studies is from Yildiz University in Istanbul, Turkey, and her BA in archaeology and history of art is from the University of Athens, Greece. She has worked in Turkey, the US, and Barbados. Her work centers on the alignment of people, programs, and resources to maximize engagement with cultural heritage connections and to make the past accessible, exciting, and relevant to diverse audiences. As a practicing archivist, she has completed archival processing and digitization projects in the Caribbean with a special focus on colonial archives. Through grants from the British Library's Endangered Archives Program and UCLA's Modern Endangered Archives Program, she has led digitization projects with archival collections in partnership with the Barbados Archives. Before that, she completed the archival processing and digitization of the records of the Synagogue Restoration Project in Bridgetown, Barbados. In her research, Amalia is interested in augmenting historical scholarship on diasporas and the underrepresented populations through linking and enriching dispersed collections. She has published extensively on issues of colonial archives, archival silences, and knowledge construction. Dr. Levy will be joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Marcia, for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone for staying until this time in the afternoon. Era was lucky because she didn't have a scientist in the room, but what can I say with half the room being archivists and librarians? I don't know. So bear with me, please. I will be talking as someone who has been and worked with archival collections in Barbados since 10 years now, and the last 4 or 5 years, I've been completely immersed doing my doctoral research with Barbadian collections, not only in Barbados, but also those that have gone to the UK, to London, and even, believe it or not, Barbadian material in Cincinnati. That's another story that you can come now. I'm doing some shameless self-promotion on May 26th, I'm giving a lecture at the Barbados Museum, so if you want more information on that aspect of my research, I would love you if you could make it there to listen. So today, let's do with the green button now. Okay, so a little bit of an overview of my presentation will be on archives and legacies of empire. I will discuss then a variety of concepts of digitizing these colonial archives. I will be discussing about a focal question of my doctoral research was essentially, why do we find what we find? When we go in an archives and we find a paper there, that paper is not there by chance. In a sense, it was meant to be preserved and found. So why do we find it? And then I will be giving some concluding thoughts. Both, especially Dr. Griffin in the morning, he discussed extensively about the Caribbean archives as being archives of empire. But I wanted a little bit, I will be giving you a little bit more context here. What is the job of empires? First of all, they produce huge amounts of data because they set and administer boundaries, they classify and categorize people, they establish who is included or excluded, they reward and punish, they consolidate, legitimize, and protect property. And when we talk about huge amounts of data, for those who cannot see, at the back of the room, we are talking about the UK National Archives having 185 kilometers, shelf kilometers of material. The Amsterdam City Archives, 50 kilometers, and the Dutch National Archives, 140 kilometers. So we are speaking at that level of huge archives. And of course, all these things during the time that empires produce all these records, they do it because they want to produce race, gender, class, and belonging. And so, in a sense, archival documents, they are not only papers, they are powerful technologies of rule, where racial categories were altered, new classifications were tried out, and also where knowledge was selected, what will be preserved. And it was the knowledge that was selected was the knowledge that would confer more power, of course, to the colonial administration. And at the end of this creation of the documents, it's again the empire that mediates what will be remembered. It defines what will be preserved or destroyed. So not everything has been preserved, and we will see what has been destroyed. And it's again empire that renders this information accessible. If you are able to go and find or read something, these have been made accessible to you, or it could be also made inaccessible. And also decide on how data are named or remain nameless and unfindable. All these processes, it's a series of processes that we call archival violence. This results in archival silences, obviously. And I could be again going for 3 hours, but I'm not going to do that. So what post-colonial countries inherited is not only the documents, but also the record-keeping systems too. These were systems that were meant to dominate, and this was done by memoranda on records management that was issued from London to all the colonies, and all the British civil service filing systems also were exported to the colonies. So all these ways that documents work today, all these have been inherited from colonial empires. Just to give a small example, what happened to records from 37 former British colonies during decolonization. There were records that they were destroyed, and they were called watch files. They were incriminating records to Her Majesty's government. These records were burnt to ashes or thrown to the ocean. Other records were simply removed and brought to the UK, and they have been remained hidden, literally, until the 2010s. And they were brought to light by a group of people in Kenya that they were subjected to torture, and they started seeking a redress. And these removed migrated archives from the former colonies, we are talking again about, I'm not sure that this 200 meters is correct, but now I cannot check it right now. And then there were also other legacy files. These were files that were deemed sanitized enough. They remained in the former colonies, and in the place of the removed ones, some dummy files were put there, and post-colonial governments never were informed that some things have been destroyed. So that was the continuation, or rather the discontinuation of how things were managed. And all this operation from the 50s to the 70s, it was called Operation Legacy, where there were literally written directions how destruction through fire should be done. The waste should be reduced to ash, and the ashes broken up. And then, or they could be destroyed by water. The documents were to be packed in weighted crates and dumped in very deep and current-free water at maximum practicable distance from the coast. So were actual instructions. So, no problem. So in a sense, what we find today, what we call archives, is never the totality of knowledge, because archives are always fragmentary. They have been subjected to a variety of processes. They have been displaced, they have been migrated, destroyed, sometimes intentionally or unintentionally. They have been made inaccessible in a variety of ways. Again, I'm not going to go into the variety of ways, and hidden. And we end up really working, what we find in archives is really always we are working with this thing there. And as Jessica Marie Johnson has said in her wonderful article, Markup Bodies, Black Life Studies and Slavery Studies at the Digital Crossroads, essentially there is no bloodless data in slavery's archive. What you find today, the data that you find today, is actually the evidence of terror. And the idea of data as fundamental and objective information obscures rather than reveals the sin of the crime. Again, what we find today are things that have been gone through a variety of processes and have been made available, but they obscure a lot of things. And what happens is that we end up creating data sets that, of course, are never representative, and it is the survivor bias. What we end up doing is working with this evidence of terror. Those are the data sets that we are creating. And you can imagine how problematic is this when we are dealing with data about slavery or other marginalized populations. And that goes back to a discussion that we had earlier with Alex, that what happens is that we create training data sets based on, we create AI training data sets based on data sets that already suffer from gaps and omissions, that are biased, that are decontextualized, that are constructed essentially, and that are always partial. So after this introduction about all the kinds of issues of colonial archives, I will touch a little bit about on what's going on when we digitize these colonial archives. The aim of reformatting, so the aim of changing, for the lay people in the room, in the back of the room, the changing the material so that it can be preserved and read, so from analog to digital, or or handwritten to typed and whatnot. The aim of reformatting is to faithfully produce a record, and so to preserve the authenticity of the record, the reliability, and the evidentiary value of the record. And a little bit, again, not of course, for those who are not familiar with the archival terminology, authenticity of a record means that how do we know that a record is genuine and free of tampering? Of course, that is debatable, and we will not go into that, what is a genuine and free of tampering record. And reliability, the concept of the record as being a reliable evidence of what it documents. And so both these values, authenticity and reliability, shows that the integrity of a document and establishes authenticity. Again, going back to what we were talking about, birth certificates. Okay, that's an authentic document, but does it really convey all cultural aspects? Again, a lot to say there. And so if we digitize what survives, then whom do we end up digitizing, essentially? Whose documents are deemed reliable and selected for digitization? Which are the bureaucratic processes that confer authenticity? What voices are amplified through digitization? And whose stories eventually are selected for reformatting? This is a well-known phrase that master voices essentially tell master stories. Again, in the archives, as in the morning Dr. Griffin said, you're not going to find really Caribbean memory because archives are preserving master voices. And so, as Jeanette Bastian has said, the full story is not told unless the cargo has a voice and the population speaks. So you can never have a full voice unless you include all voices. And this is, I want to comment here on this new initiative of the Barbados government that seeks to, through this road program, emphasize untold stories, those of the enslaved, the liberated, and their descendants. So this is a conscious effort to promote and unearth these stories. So as we discuss, not only we start out with partial data sets, but always digitization is partial because it's always selective, it favors written documents, and perpetuates and reproduces silences, and of course, offensive legacy descriptions. As I already mentioned, we inherit structure and content from imperial regimes. And because digitization is conditioned by the physicality of the medium, it reflects those structure and assumptions. For example, one way that records were preserved and stored by colonial authorities were in volumes. It was meant to facilitate storage of information, but also obscures the way original records were produced, transmitted, and used by people on the ground. Also, digitization, something that all speakers mentioned, digitization is expensive. It's time-consuming, resource-intensive. It requires long-term institutional support and all kind of issues, and that ends up being a heavy burden for smaller nations and marginalized voices that always end up being disadvantaged. Oops. Okay, now you will see it in slow motion. Okay, now you learned it. Okay. Okay, also digitization obscures because documents are scanned as images. Item level metadata are always an issue. Usually mass digitization has issues of things not being correctly, having correct metadata and those not easily findable, as well as not being described properly. And access points always favor the creator, the person who assumes to have created the record. Again, voiceless populations, if we don't make a concerted effort, voiceless populations remained locked away. And so, I hope that's not mine. No. Okay. So we digitize a very small part of humanity's memory. We start out from a huge amount of information from the human past through disasters. We inherit the historical record. The historical record is selected material to be preserved in archives and libraries. This is essentially what Michel Rolf-Trouillot has talked about, a variety of archival silences. Again, undergo selection, material that are digitized. Some material are being put online, and so what happens is what we today access online and what AI training data sets are trained or as all these very small parts. So sometimes when I hear people making assertions, everything is now findable, and AIs can give me the correct answer. That's not it, because the largest part of human wisdom and the past is not there, essentially, has not been included. And so another aspect then is that digitization essentially, due to technology, reifies that what is already visible. That's the positivisms of systems, epistemology, and tools. So we digitize that small part of human memory that we saw. And again, digitization is problematic because in a document, we don't read the document to read what information is there. There is so much information that is not said, information that is alluded to, information that is hidden, also hidden intentionally, what we discussed about people who want to be actually remain obscured. We discussed that earlier. So there are communities that have hidden information in there, other information that is misleading or ambiguous. And so what again, the same thing. Okay, fine. So what happens is that what we end up digitizing is essentially this. We digitize for the information on the paper, and we lose the underlying context. And then, so that is why it's important as practitioners, but also as scholars, to always interrogate the collections and data that we access and we use. What some people have termed as ethnography of collections or archaeology of collections. So we can ask questions, how did that collection, so nothing is neutral. So when you find a document, how this collection came to be, who were the creators, when it was reformatted, who funded this work, where is hosted, and what was included and excluded. So behind each document, in a sense, there is this big world of information that can tell us a lot about how this document was created and transmitted and whatnot. And the important thing, and that was a bad part, it was a bad part because it was very tough to do this kind of work. During my research, understanding these processes of silencing, so paying attention to what is not there and ask question, why? If I expected something to be there, why it is not there? When did this silencing happen? What was the process? What human actors were involved? What activities and processes led to it? What algorithms were involved? And then when is a point, at what point that silence becomes visible and why? That also can tell us a lot. And that takes me to the question that I told you about. This was a focal question during my doctoral research, which focused on developing life stories of enslaved people in early modern Barbados. And so I arrived to the point of asking, considering the vast omissions and gaps and losses of information, it is important to understand how, where, and in what format we access a record. And so, again, this question. And some scholars have said it better than me. For example, a true theory of archives requires not only analysis of papers, but interrogations of process, place, and power, Jared Drake. And then Julia Laite, I never can tell her name properly, but the traces of lives that we find now on the internet did not come our way by chance. They are products of past and present political, social, and economic power. And another archival theorist, Eric Ketelaar, has says, archival documents and our systems contain tacit narratives which must be deconstructed in order to understand the meanings of archives. And finally, and sorry for the too much theory, but all those important words, Tom Nesmith has said that processes of the record's inscription, transmission, contextualization, and interpretation account for its existence, characteristics, and continuing history. And so one thing, just to make it concrete, a big aspect that I grappled with a group of records at the Barbados Archives was the issue of the recopied volumes, which was the deeds and wills volumes at the archives. These were transcriptions that were done in the early 20th century due to the deterioration of the paper of the original volumes. And these were transcriptions that were done haphazardly, no order. It was done as soon as something became deteriorated, but so some things, what happened is that some years were transcribed, other years are missing. And then there are a lot of mistakes, especially names and such information, and many of even the recopied volumes are missing in the indices. I have a whole chapter of one story of a woman that she was not in the indices, and the whole volume was not in the indices. Theorizing this aspect, one thing that I wrote about was what I call record keeping or archival dependencies. So what is essentially the materials, practices, processes, and infrastructures, and the actors involved that shape the historical record and affect knowledge production about the past. So this is something that I was seeing always my material through this lens. Again, why did this paper arrive to my hands? Through what processes? And so I ended up having a chapter that started out with one document. So the whole chapter was based on one document. I mean, of course, with other documents explaining it, but I had 30 pages of discussion why that document was found where it was found. Hopefully when it gets published, you will know. And this goes back, of course, a little bit to go back a little bit to the discussion about AI, is that all these archival and record-keeping dependencies, they don't suddenly disappear when we digitize things or we make AI data sets. Essentially, we are feeding these machines essentially with garbage, information that has been selected and is partial. And so all these effects are cascading down with each reformatting. And those omissions and silences in analog records persist. And not only they persist, but they are perpetuated and they are magnified in the digital, because now everyone with a phone can find information that is biased and partial. Okay, you know, by now you're used to this, drilling information. So the problem is that rather than focusing on digitization as a technical process, essentially, digitization is not about people, okay? It's not no, digitization is not about documents, essentially. It's about people. And so, as Stuart Hall has said, today, each of us, we can ask different questions from historical collections. Most people see archival collections are those dusty boxes, that they are inert collections. But always, these collections are in a dialogical relationship with the present, and it is us who put questions to these collections, and each generation will ask different questions from the previous one. And that we come back to why we also, again, another, I think, topic that we discussed in the morning is why many of this material, we cannot rely on legacy descriptions and descriptions that have been handed down from us, and many have to be redescribed with an intent to bring to light silenced voices, to challenge essentially what information has been handed down as authentic and reliable, also as an aspect of reparatory justice, and to shift the lens from the creator to the community of records, again, that Dr. Griffin mentioned in his talk. So rather than seeing one person as the creator, there is a whole community of records in that record. And here I will give the example of, this is a digitized manumission volume from Jamaica. And so, essentially what happens is that digitization and descriptive standards obscure the reality on the ground. So this is, has been described as one object. You see the title there. It says Manumission Liber, Volume 9. But if you go through the document, there are about 300 names of enslaved people that right now exist, of course, locked away in digitized images. And you cannot really locate them or find them as such. And if we go back to issues of reparatory justice and reparations, as Pedro Welch has, may he rest in peace, as he has said, making the case for reparation requires sound grounding in the documentary evidence. So this documentary evidence, instead of simply inheriting it, we can use it, it can be used for reparatory justice. And also another question that I've had as I was going through volumes of deeds, that the text was identical constantly because it's a legal text. And I will go back to what Era said about having 7 copies of each deed. So if there is a text that the text is standard because it's a legal text, do you really need to have the same thing? And so, again, going through the deeds, is digitization always the correct approach? For example, a large part of these colonial documents are mundane, boring, and repetitive. They were compiled for transactions and property, and they were meant, they had stamps and dates to make them look authentic, let's say so. But in some cases like that, datification works better than digitization. For example, rather than digitizing a 500-book volume that is essentially constantly the same text, datafying the information within might be more useful. Here I will also, another approach, again, we'll go back to Alex's talk, embracing simplicity for broader access, reducing technological complexity, energy storage and labor, and maximize access in low bandwidth environments. And of course, nowadays we are all used to work with digital things. It's so convenient to be in our houses at 11 p.m. and be able to access digitized documents, but why would you miss the fun in the archives, essentially? You know, so beyond digitization, going to the archives, there is the element of serendipity. You go there and you don't really, you work with a document, but then you see 10 other things when you work with analog documents, something that you lose in digitized environment. So essentially, when you go to archives, and it has happened to me repeatedly, you do not find things, essentially things find you. Somehow it happens and they come your way. And going again about reparative description, going beyond legacy descriptions, another thing that I want to emphasize is the need to show the underlying archival infrastructures. And in this description, we need to, when there is not there, we need to emphasize the unique connections among material, to incorporate diverse views, particularly if the material belong to marginalized communities. And do this as an aim to challenge colonial worldviews. And also, when we work with data sets, all these things that we can see in the data, we need to make it explicit in the logics of the data. Alex emphasized this need also. We need to always work with data that we contextualize. We acknowledge the gaps, the biases and omissions. Just because something is called AI or it's online, it doesn't mean that it's authoritative, because it can be, has plenty of gaps. And also we need to highlight the methods that we used, the assumptions, conventions, and the limitations. And of course, why we focus on digital, so to speak, trees, we end up neglecting the vast analog forest. What happens is that still today, people think that everything exists online, but maybe not more than, is it 1% or 10% of archives has been digitized. So most of humanity's past is not digitized. A lot of humanity's past is subject to disasters, fires, wars, floods, and you name it. And the urgency to protect is there, rather than always prioritizing digitization, because that is what gets us money. Documentation actually is more important, because documentation can be done more speedily, and at least if something is lost, you have a record of it until you spend 5 years digitizing something. And I want to conclude by saying that we do have power, because in fact, the history that gets remembered is the one that is funded. So we can use the funding that we have and the tools of our profession to tell stories that have not been told. And so we are not as powerless as maybe the larger public might think. And with this, I would like to thank you.